All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Osint Bunker podcast that definitely isn't weekly anymore. So that. Um, I know it's weird that I'm leading us in today, but John is not here. But we have replaced him with someone with far more experience in the field and in command. We have now, if I'm not wrong, you retired as a lieutenant colonel, if I'm not incorrect.
That's great.
Lieutenant
It's
Colonel
Lieutenant
Stuart.
Colonel.
Lieutenant,
Yep.
sorry. The
No,
the
no,
the
no.
American is
It's Lieutenant Colonel over your side and Lieutenant Colonel this side.
yes. I'm Americanizing everything because of course I'll the two of us that are the Americans will take over. But Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, who has some deep experience, especially on the armored side of the equation. And I'll just sort of let you describe yourself and let you kind of lead us in here.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that. My name's Stuart Crawford. I suppose my essential background is that I spent 20 years as a regular officer in the Royal Tank Regiment, specifically in the 4th Royal Tank Regiment, which was very much the Scottish one. And you may pick up slight sort of Scottish twang in my voice. And during that time, I went through the whole gamut of troop leading and then a headquarters position and various courses, and ended up leading a squadron in Germany just towards the end of the Cold War before we all drew down. One other claim to fame is that I was a graduate of the British Army Staff College. I'm also a graduate of the US Army Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, where I spent a very happy year, after which I then came back to the British Army Staff College as an instructor. So I've been round the block a couple of times on that. Currently I'm working, well, I'm retired at the age now, but I'm now working in the media side with a regular column in Britain's Daily Express, which is a sort of mid-market newspaper, and some broadcast stuff, including CNN International, BBC, Turkish television, Polish television, and so on and so forth. So that's where I am at the moment.
No, that's great. And I know, I think, just leading into probably the part that everyone wants to hear, you did have some staff experience during the first Gulf War. Am I correct?
Yes, you are absolutely correct. I was sent out as an individual as a staff officer to the first Gulf War, what you would call Desert Storm, I think we called Op Granby. And I was in the British Theatre headquarters, which was headquarters British Forces Middle East in Riyadh, where the general to whom I was working was General Sir Peter de la Billiere. So it wasn't an operational headquarters, it was a theatre headquarters. It was basically the British headquarters, which had ultimately had the job of either saying yes or no to our US coalition partners and leaders. But thankfully it never came to that.
And I know that kind of gives you a really interesting point of view to the entire situation. You really did have that kind of eye in the sky, theater level command view of the conflict. And at least from, obviously everyone starts to get, making comparisons to armored warfare and comparing to the current conflict in Ukraine. And I think the Russian intention during the first few weeks of the invasion was to create something very similar to the first Gulf War. Maintain air superiority immediately, and march heavily armored columns towards major Ukrainian positions, surround them, defeat them, encircle them, and then capture larger civilian populations. And sort of how does that compare with sort of the intention and then the execution of the coalition during the invasion?
Right, the coalition invasion of Iraq and Kuwait back in 1991 was a pretty impressive piece of work, to be perfectly honest. It was led by the Americans, whose staff work, one hesitates to say was immaculate, but it was pretty good. And of course, it was predicated on overwhelming combat power being visited on the enemy. I have a couple of reservations about the fact that I think that they always say in war it's a cardinal mistake to underestimate your enemy. And I think one could extend that and say it's also a bit of a mistake to overestimate your enemy. And I think we overestimated the Iraqi army, large and equipped with lots of equipment, though it was. It turned out to be very much a third world army dressed up in first world equipment to a certain extent. And I think people knew that before we launched across. But the big difference between the first Gulf War and what's happening in Ukraine is, of course, that the Allies had overwhelming air superiority and therefore could basically range at will across the Kuwait theatre of operations. Yes, we lost a few aircraft, but in the round, it wasn't actually that many compared to how it might have been. Nobody has got air superiority in Ukraine or has had it in the past. And whilst it was the Russian intention, I think, to do a classic sort of decapitation of the government by driving down the motorway, capturing Kiev and getting rid of Zelensky and co., the Ukrainians had pretty good intelligence what was coming. And I won't make any accusations where that intelligence came from, but I think we can all guess. And so they dispersed a lot of their assets. And the Russians really underestimated the tenacity and courage of the Ukrainian defenders. And now we are where we are today, a bit of a stalemate. Small gains there, small losses there, more like First World War, attritional warfare than it is anything that we saw towards the end of the Second World War or indeed in Iraq.
Yeah, and I think going back to what you said, one of the most interesting vignettes I think I've found from the war was the First Tank Brigade, whose garrison legitimately sits right on the border with Russia or with Belarus, sort of right on the other side of the Dnieper from Chernobyl, and when they 24 hours, maybe less than 24 hours before the outbreak of hostilities, they basically road marched their entire brigade from their garrison and took up positions in the nearest city, Chernihiv, and proceeded to both fight delaying actions and also hold the city, and significantly threaten Russian supply lines for over a month. When you sort of see that, how much of a reaction is that? How much of a feat is that to sort of pick everyone up from the garrison and just go move, with that very short notice?
Well, it's pretty impressive, actually, and it shows a certain agility in the command and control aspects of the Ukrainian military. But I think that the Russians made a number of assumptions. I think they assumed that attacking Ukraine would be the same as attacking Georgia or attacking Chechnya to a certain extent, or even the annexation of Crimea some 8 years beforehand. And they really weren't very clever about it. They attacked at the wrong time of year where they couldn't get off the roads because the ground is sodden and vehicles become bogged. And they didn't get their combined arms operation in place as they should have done. And so it was a combination of the Russians being rather sort of lackadaisical about how they went about their business, and the Ukrainians, to a certain extent, pre-warned, being agile and decisive, which led to the Russian. I mean, it's the Russian defeat at Kiev. I don't think there's any doubt about it. They were defeated at Kiev, particularly when they failed to capture the airfield at Hostomel, I think it is. So it was impressive stuff. The problem is, of course, that it's still a lopsided battle. The Russians have got huge amounts of men and material, not all of the most modern, but the Ukrainians are outnumbered in almost every aspect. And slowly but surely, the West is beginning to re-equip and train the Ukrainians. So it's more of an even contest, I think.
Yeah, and I going back to that early battle around Kiev, obviously led by the VDV with their interesting mechanized force fighting structure, primarily using very lightly armed or somewhat heavily armed but lightly armored airborne infantry fighting vehicles that had certain weaknesses. I think when it came to actually dealing with some of the heavier equipment that the Ukrainians were able to actually field, at least in Kiev.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, I would throw into that equation the US supplied Javelin anti-tank missiles and the UK supplied NLAWs, the shorter range anti-tank missiles. I think the way that they were deployed and how effective they were came as a major shock to the Russians, as did the use of UAVs and drones, etc., etc. Although they should have been forewarned about the latter because of the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which was only a couple of years ago. So no, I think they were very lackadaisical in their approach, and they just thought that Ukraine would crumble. Everybody would say, "Oh well, here they are." Zelensky would go into exile or disappear, and a puppet government would be reinstalled because that's what had happened before on other occasions, and they just got it completely wrong.
Yeah, and I also find it interesting the Russians attempted, or at least, to preface the viewers who might not be as familiar with this, but the Russians very heavily utilize a tactical formation or a tactical grouping called the Battalion Tactical Group,
Mm-hmm.
which is a combination of splitting up regimental sized formations into more smaller, technically holistic units. But do you think that ended up being a weakness in Ukraine, especially around Kharkiv?
Yes, I think it may well have done because obviously the battalion tactical group is doesn't compare with a brigade combat team, if you like, and I just think that they underestimated or overestimated what they could do with the formations that they were used to and that they tried to use in the invasion. A battalion tactical group isn't very big in sort of conflict terms, really. And I'm talking against myself because I remember 20 years ago arguing in the British Army that we should adopt the same sort of all arms grouping rather than have the traditional British infantry and tank regiments. And now I'm not so sure. I don't think they are big enough to be able to have a real impact of mass on the battlefield.
Yeah, and it's that situational problem where something that might work really well in an anti-insurgency operation, which maybe is what the Russians plan to deal with in Ukraine, but is far less able to deal with an actual organized enemy that's relying on traditional brigade structure or traditional battalion structure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think also that I mean, certainly in the Second World War, the Germans were very successful in sticking together, I think, what they called Kampfgruppe, which is basically an ad hoc arrangement using all the troops that were available at the time for the actual action. But that was driven by necessity rather than by doctrine. But they managed to do it very successfully because, I mean, they were certainly up until late 1944, 1945, a very well trained, if not terribly well equipped army. So I think that, I've said this 100 times in stuff that I've been writing for the newspapers. Mass matters. If there's one lesson that comes out of Ukraine, is that numbers matter. And I'm now beginning to think that this Western practice, and I'm thinking of the UK in particular, but it may apply elsewhere, of having small numbers of highly competent, technically advanced fighting vehicles, for example, like tanks, but which cost a fortune, whether we're in danger of putting our limited eggs into one basket, and we might be better off going for large numbers or larger numbers of less capable vehicles because losses are inevitable. And I came up with this calculation, and it's completely sort of, back of a fag packet, that if a new Leopard 2, for example, or an M1A1 costs, say, $10 million, well, you can actually get about 50 T-55s for that. And with the best will in the world, one M1A1 or M1A2 or Leopard 2A7 isn't going to defeat 50 T-55s. They'll just be overwhelmed.
Yeah, and I think, but at the same time, you go back to the crewing issues, where if you have, a limited population, and also a limited population of service members that you can actually put in uniform, sans going back to conscription, and I don't think any of us imagine that would be politically popular. But I think as we're seeing, at least in southern Ukraine right now, is that you have to have a level of crew competency to actually utilize any type of platform, whether it be an older BMP-1 or a Leopard 2A6. And I do think there is that debate to be had on both crew competency, crew experience, and also the defense economic side of things.
Oh, no, I couldn't agree more. I have always and long said, and I've said until people are fed up me saying it, that I'd much rather have a well-trained and competent crew in an inferior vehicle than a badly trained crew in a superior one.
Yeah, and it just goes back to training time and resource allocation for crews as well. Um,
Yep.
and
It all
and
comes back to money in the end, I'm afraid. It all comes back to budget.
Yeah, it's all a budgetary issue. Um, and I think the biggest one there as well is sort of the supply situation. I think we saw, early on, and even today, Ukraine is dealing with a number of different disparate systems that all require their own supply pipeline and all require, separate replacement parts. And Russia early in the war had their own issues with supplies. And where do you think that kind of figures into the current equation in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I think that we in Western countries in NATO were working on a presumption of consumption of things like artillery shells and so on and so forth, which was so completely off the pace for modern conventional warfare in Europe that everybody's had to rethink again. And of course, the factory capacity isn't there to produce them in the numbers that are required. So I think that the military industrial complex is really having to strain to produce the required amounts of munitions for Ukraine, but also to start manufacturing the required amounts of munitions for their own countries' military. And I know this is happening in the United States with its huge industrial capacity, and I know that it's happening in the UK to a lesser but significant extent. For example, the factory in Belfast that makes the NLAW anti-tank weapon, I mean, it must be working 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year at the moment.
Yeah, and I well know that the U.S. ammunition manufacturing plants that mostly are focused on artillery shells that are in Pennsylvania right now are running double triple shifts every single day,
Yep.
and also relying on very interesting places to acquire weapons. I know there was a report either today or yesterday from a Ukrainian rocket artillery unit using BM-21 Grad rockets that were seized somehow from North Korea.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I read that. That was very interesting.
yeah, and sort of these, I think there is only a point at which when North Korea has somehow a better defense manufacturing base for artillery shells and rockets than NATO countries and other Western countries. There is kind of that not it's not even a debate because it's just a well realized issue that at least Europe and the United States is kind of falling behind on that underlying manufacture of equipment.
Yeah, I mean, the lesson from Ukraine is that you need tons of stuff to do it properly. And I think that certainly the UK and maybe to a certain extent the US were lulled into a false sense of security by the counterinsurgency and counter-terror wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, where there wasn't a huge expenditure of ammunition because the targets to fire at were asymmetric, smaller, more mobile, etc., and not dug into prepared positions. And I think that sort of was a false lesson. And they always say, that certainly in Britain, we always enter the next war perfectly prepared for the last. And I think, Ukraine just underlines the truth of that.
No, absolutely, and I think that again, as you said, the Iraq issue, the M777 crew that fires maybe 5 or 6 shells a day, versus the crew in Ukraine who's actively working to see how many tens of thousands of shells they can put through a single barrel.
Yeah, no,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, firing, in some cases, hundreds of rounds per day.
yeah, and
So it's just a different order of magnitude that to that which we were expecting. But we should have known, because if you look at Second World War, for example, which is probably the most comparable conflict to the one going on in Ukraine at the moment, the Allies, expended millions of tons of munitions in breaking through the German lines. The UK and Canadian armies in Op Goodwood lost a third of their tanks in 3 days. And we've just lost sight of that.
No, absolutely. And if you even look at the calculations for a fold the gap scenario, the preparations that were made, the anticipated both losses and ammunition expenditure were incredibly high. And I think a lot of that thinking kind of it faded with kind of the rise of, at least the third world state as the threat, or the asymmetric group as the main threat.
Yeah, the war on terror completely sort of took people's eye off the ball of conventional armoured warfare against a peer or near-peer enemy. And so we're just having to learn again.
No, absolutely, and in some ways the Ukrainians are suffering because of that those lessons have to be learned again.
Yeah, I think that I have great sympathy for Zelensky and the Ukrainians and their demands for munitions and weaponry from the West, because they are almost fighting a proxy war for NATO. Not quite, because NATO isn't exactly calling the agenda, although it's got a very big influence on the agenda. But the Ukrainians are fighting, and we're not. And thank goodness we're not. But one has to have a certain amount of sympathy for them, saying, well, give us the weaponry to do it properly. And we seem to have been slightly, what I would call, mealy-mouthed and tiptoeing around the topic and releasing weaponry to them, somehow fearing that we're going to escalate the conflict. And we're being bullied by Russia. The West is being bullied by Russia into not doing stuff. And my personal view is that we should reverse that, and NATO and the West should start bullying Russia into doing what our agenda suggests we should do.
Yeah, and I always think about, the potential ramifications, or the potential consequences. I know you had talked earlier this week about the Wagner threat towards Poland. What if Russia, uses their existing asymmetric groups to potentially, pressure NATO countries, or even, conduct kinetic attacks against NATO countries? What would be the consequences to something like that?
Well, that's a difficult one to guess, but I guess my hypothesis would be if the Wagner Group, which is, and if I think we all know, at a sort of at arm's length instrument of the Russian state, if the Wagner Group were to attack Poland, it really would mean that Russia is attacking Poland. And of course, under NATO Article 5, as you're well aware, attack against one NATO member is to be taken as attack against them all. And there's no doubt that should it come to direct confrontation, certainly in my opinion, between NATO and Russia, there would only be one winner, and it wouldn't be Russia. What devastation might ensue before that happens, I wouldn't be able to guess. But I don't think Putin really wants a direct confrontation with NATO, and so the idea that Wagner might invade Poland is, it's part of the distraction, it's part of Maskirovka, if you like, it's part of the whole military deception thing. But I really don't think at the moment that it's a realistic scenario.
I think the Poles are very much waiting in anticipation for a Wagner group, which has mostly disarmed from their heavy weapons, to attempt to conduct some form of infantry assault per se, into Polish territory. I think you would agree that the Poles are fairly well equipped to handle an issue like that.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't mess with the Poles. Not now that they've got the bit between their teeth, and their military will be, if it isn't already, the strongest military in Europe, with modern weaponry and a great military tradition. So I really, if I was advising Mr. Putin, I would say you really don't want to mess with the Poles, because they'll punch you really hard back.
And it is really interesting looking at the Polish, expenditure, looking at the Polish modernization plans, as someone who has, looked forward to force modernization before. Is that kind of that dream scenario where the Polish military has been given the proper resources to do what they need to do?
Well, it's beginning to look like it. I mean, I'm very impressed by the fact that they have, I think, come to an arrangement with South Korea to purchase some of the most modern South Korean tanks, and I can't remember the nomenclature of them, but also to construct a factory in Poland that will produce the bulk of them. Plus, they've got the US Aegis system, anti-missile system already in Poland, and they've got the Patriot system. And they have large numbers of troops and vehicles, and their budget has increased significantly. So I think Poland is taking it seriously. And I also think that the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, are also taking it seriously within their own sort of fiscal constraints.
Yeah, at the same time, if you look at, what has happened to the Russian units that have been, menacing the Baltic states for the past, 20 plus years, nearing 30 years at this point. But that those units have obviously sort of not evaporated per se, but a lot of them are either, combat ineffective or otherwise occupied in Ukraine. How does that kind of change the calculation for those states right now?
Well, I mean, it's we live in extraordinary times, and whereas maybe 5 years ago, or even less than that, maybe 2 years ago, we might not have envisaged a scenario whereby Russia might attack the Baltic states, or indeed Finland. We now have to revise our thinking because they've done it with Ukraine. Everybody thought that was crazy and that it wasn't going to happen, but it did. So I think that we just have to be aware that the Russians and under Putin don't necessarily behave in what we in the West would see as a logical thought pattern. And there are other forces at play there, probably internal, which allow them to do what some of us would see as outlandish acts. But I mean, the whole sort of thing of invading Ukraine has, as we all know, had the opposite effect. It has prevented temporarily the accession of Ukraine to NATO, but it's also persuaded two very traditionally neutral countries in Finland and Sweden to join. So it's been completely counterproductive for the Russian state.
I know Russia previously having a certain degree of at least not neutrality per se or even-handedness with both Finland and Sweden, but now those two are firmly within NATO, or at least Finland is firmly within NATO. Sweden appears to be firmly within NATO in the coming months. But that, does that change the Russian calculus in their plans for Europe?
Oh, I think undoubtedly, if you look at the Finnish military, it's pretty impressive actually. It's almost a sort of whole nation mobilization in waiting, and they've got some great equipment, and I think that they have some well motivated troops, especially when it comes to if they have to defend their homeland. And Sweden also has got a fairly impressive military. And the interesting thing from a NATO point of view is that Finland having acceded to NATO and Sweden shortly to do so, as soon as the final Turkish objections are overcome, which I'm sure they will be, it basically turns the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, because the Russians only have access to it at St. Petersburg and also from Kaliningrad, where their Baltic Sea fleet is. But all the exits from the Baltic Sea are blocked, via the strait between Denmark and Sweden. So NATO is much, much stronger now in the northern flank than it ever has been.
Yeah, and that definitely has been, at least, and I know the second I'm going to mention Northern Defender, George is going to jump in and and talk about UK force presence in the region. But that has been a NATO focus. recently with cooperating, especially with Norway.
No, absolutely, yeah. And I can't remember the name of the exercises that were late last year or earlier last year, but I remember talking about them on various TV programs. And yeah, I mean, we have to be ever vigilant because the Russians will always identify and exploit any mistakes or gaps that we have.
No, absolutely, and I think I'll direct this one more towards George, but I know recently HMS Prince of Wales is now back out and actually exercising again, or at least in workups. But how does that sort of fit into the equation right now, at least in the North Atlantic?
So yeah, HMS Prince of Wales is currently sailing around the North Sea. She's currently exercising the jets, and she's making a massive show of it. I don't know if anyone really follows Mill Twitter at all, but it's I think after the I mean I'm sure we're all aware of what happened to HMS Prince of Wales very recently. Her stint as the NATO flagship didn't go particularly well, but I think they're making up for it, and they really are making up for it, and with pace. They're making a big song and dance about it.
Yeah, I know that I personally I don't follow the HMS Prince of Wales Twitter account, but I have been seeing a number of tweets from it coming across my For You page over the past week or so. So I think that's definitely an element of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if I could just butt in here and say, I think that Prince of Wales has now got a reputation to salvage,
Absolutely.
and it's not their fault that the shaft was off, whatever it was, off bearing and had to be repaired at vast expense. But they won't want to do that again, and they'll want to show their mettle and show that they're at least as good as the other aircraft carrier, Queen Elizabeth. So yeah, I mean, in a funny sort of strange sort of way, the fact that they did have these mechanical troubles and had to go into refit for 9 months might be in the longer term more productive for them in terms of operational capacity because they'll be absolutely desperate not to get it wrong again.
Oh no, I actually find myself watching, the various marine traffic apps just to. I think last time the issue was discovered when the Prince of Wales started going quite slowly. For what she was out. I think she was actually was it power tests she was doing at the time after departing Portsmouth.
Yeah, Portsmouth or wherever it was, Devonport or wherever it was.
Yeah, but then tugs started to appear, and it's she didn't get too far on her last voyage, and it's just nice to see that she's still going. You know, this this close to her leaving Rosyth.
Yeah.
So
I think that her commanding officer, the captain, must have been completely and utterly pissed off when
yeah,
his planned deployment across the Atlantic to wherever it was, New York, I think,
yeah,
was called off because of mechanical failure. Hugely embarrassing for the Royal Navy, but these things happen. I mean, every ship that isn't of more than 6 or 7 in the class, they're all basically prototypes,
oh yeah.
and with prototypes you expect things not to go right, but let's hope they've got it right now.
Well, that's exactly the way it was explained to me when I was on board. That the Royal Navy have built two massive prototypes that are even within the same class. There are major differences between each ship, so it's good that they're back on track. And I believe it is Prince of Wales that's going to the US shortly to conduct trials with drones. For the life of me, I cannot remember the project name, but it's I want to say Mojave project. I
I,
can't
I
remember.
don't know, George, but yeah, it sounds sort of that's what's going to happen.
But anyway, changing the topic slightly from Prince of Wales and the ship's many noteworthy incidents, I wanted to ask you, obviously, Stuart, you've spoken before, you've written before on Russian disinformation, and I believe it was the Express, an article for the Express where you argued that Russia's best weapon is lies. Could you expand upon this and explain how disinformation works, for an audience member who may not be particularly familiar with it? and sort of explain how it works in the context of NATO and the West. What are Russia doing to try and undermine NATO and the West in that sort of context?
Okay, well, very quickly, let's just mention the sort of categories. Information is what we're all familiar with. It's stuff that comes into us, and in the military context, lots of different sources of information are collated and so on, and usually produce eventually what's called intelligence. So that's fine, and we all understand that. Misinformation is basically information that's wrong. And it can be wrong for a whole host of reasons. It can be wrong because people have interpreted stuff wrongly. It can be wrong because the source was wrong, and so on and so forth. But disinformation is the deliberate manipulation of information to present a false picture. And that's the thing that we have to be very careful about in the West. And it's also the thing that the Russians are very, very good at and have been for certainly since the beginning of the last century. And you see it in every aspect. I mean, their term, maskarovka, is usually translated as being deception and camouflage, but it covers a whole spectrum of stuff, from painting your tank white in winter, which seems pretty obvious stuff, to sending in troops into Crimea in 2014 with no badges of rank, so nobody really knew where they came from until it was all over, to their various operations during the Second World War and beyond. The difference between Russian disinformation and Western disinformation is that the Russians tend to do it, Soviets, Russians tend to do it on an epic scale. And so if you look at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942-43, for example, the Russians moved armies to mount their counteroffensive without the Germans knowing that that's what they were doing. They assembled artillery, ammunition, and managed to do it behind a screen of camouflage and deception. And so when the blow came, it was least expected. They did the same at Kursk. They did the same with Operation Bagration in 1945, which basically ended the Nazi regime. And they're past masters at it, and it's deeply ingrained in their doctrine. We in the West also use disinformation. I can give you the example of the Ghost Army in Kent, which existed just before the Normandy landings on the 6th of June 1944, which persuaded the Germans that the main thrust was going to come across the Dover Strait and into Calais, when quite clearly it wasn't. And then even at a lower scale, Operation Mincemeat, with the poor homeless chap who'd become deceased in London, was dressed up as a Royal Marines officer and dumped off a submarine off the coast of Spain, with papers which were false. So everybody does it, but I think the difference is that the Russians do it in an epic scale, and they also do it during peacetime. And it takes all sorts of forms. I mean, the cyber domain, if you want to call it that, is very much in the news these days. And the Russians are, my stuff, my little articles I write in the Daily Express, saying such and such, every single time, the same sort of trolls and bots from inside Russia come in and comment and say, well, the guy's talking rubbish, doesn't know what he's talking about. He was never a proper army officer anyway. Why was he only a lieutenant colonel? He failed. And it's just part and parcel of what they do.
Oh yeah, there was a great deal of it. Again, to jump back to everyone's favourite aircraft carrier, the Prince of Wales, there was on various, Russian language, Russian English language channels on the likes of Twitter, Facebook, all that kind of stuff. The news that HMS Prince of Wales was having parts cannibalised to go on Queen Elizabeth, which is, I'm sure many are aware, is a perfectly normal thing, especially of a ship class of 2. Though that news was spun into, the ship being scrapped, and that news grew arms and legs. No matter any sort of corrections were made by the Ministry of Defence, by various people with interest, by the Royal Navy, it just kept going. I'm still, I get tagged in tweets, for example, people tagging me in with Russian accounts complaining that, not complaining, probably, celebrating that Prince of Wales has been scrapped, when of course, it hasn't, as at sea. But
Yeah.
a more relevant question, I suppose, would be, I'm curious, how much has Russian disinformation impeded the intelligence gathering and processing for the Ukrainians in the war? Has it been a massive setback for them?
Um, Now, I don't know if I'm properly qualified to that. So may I go off at a tangent here
Of course.
and say that, and George and I have discussed this before, that we also have our own domestic disinformation campaigns. And they're much more in George's area of expertise than mine. And we're talking about essentially and mainly Scottish nationalist, Scottish independence supporters who are constantly providing the refrain that, not only that Prince of Wales has been scrapped and sold for spares, but that the British aircraft carriers have got no aircraft, that we were promised, whatever it was, 8 frigates to be built in the Clyde. There were only, 13, but there were only 8. And when you point out to these people that, in fact, yes, that's the case, but the gap was filled by other orders, they just don't believe you. And we have this thing called the betrayal of the Clyde in
Yeah,
Scotland, because
of
all the
course.
Royal Navy warships are built on the Clyde these days. And nationalists keep coming back and saying, yes, but the Clyde has been betrayed by the Tory government. And when George, primarily, and I sometimes say, well, hang on a minute, the Clyde can't build anymore. The order book is full for the next 10 years. They
Yeah.
just won't accept it. It's cognitive dissonance. But I think part of that, and I've got no proof for it whatsoever, is being driven by Russian disinformation. But I can't prove it at all. I've got no proof.
So I'll hop in briefly here, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Stuart. But I think this plays into a larger strategy that we've seen from Russian disinfo, and that's to target existing political rifts within individual countries. When it comes to the United States, there's been large-scale sort of Russian support for disinfo regarding splits between political parties in the U.S., targeting isolationist groups slash quote unquote pacifist groups in name. I call them pacifists in name only. Groups that talk about how the United States shouldn't be involved in NATO. They shouldn't be involved in the war in Ukraine. It's not our
Code
continent. It's
pink.
not our war.
Sorry.
So on and so forth. Likewise, in looking at across the ocean at Africa, when you look at disinformation run by the Wagner Group that's being Russian funded and everything, targeting particularly West African nations, talking driving narratives against the French, against the West in general, but targeting specific entities and polities within these countries that either have an axe to grind against the government in power or an axe to grind against the West, so on and so forth. And so when you talk about the betrayal of the Clyde, when you talk about Scottish political parties sort of looking at the current Tory government and things like that, I think this is a playbook that we're seeing go on around the world. I mean, we just had yet another coup in West Africa against a generally Western-friendly government. And so my question to you then was, do you believe that sort of the amplification of some of these narratives and the targeting of specific political rifts within countries is not only well within the Russian playbook, but we can expect more of it in the future?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I know you're talking about the recent coup in Niger, where the generally, as you said, pro-Western president has been deposed by his general in charge of his presidential guard. It's basically like the Roman Empire. And one of the first people to laud the coup was Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group. And you now have a belt across sub-Saharan Africa, more or less the Sahel as a whole, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, which is pivoting, or appears to be pivoting, towards Russia. And I think that they will see that as a great success. And at some point, we have to sort of, I think, I mean, people know this is happening, but we're not alive to it yet, if you know what I mean. And I think that this is very much from the Russian playbook, and this is the way that they seek to undermine the West, undermine NATO, and gain advantage. So that's the Russians, but I mean, I'm pretty certain the Chinese are doing exactly the same thing. So we've got to keep our wits about us.
I guess the follow-up question to that is, I think it's been well addressed by many different sort of guests we've had on this podcast about the effects of disinformation, how it operates. I think the question left in many of our listeners' heads is, how can it be properly addressed? I think what we've seen thus far is we've seen some cases where government institutions have addressed cases of Russian disinfo in what ways that they can via press releases and things of the sort. We've seen mostly news organizations attempt to sort of fact check and log these things. And yet, these narratives still do continue to garner traction. They continue to be generated. I mean, there's money behind them. There's ways to do that. I think the major question in everyone's heads is there a better way to combat it? Is there a way to get ahead of it? There's the quote that's commonly attributed to Churchill, but actually I think belongs to Mark Twain, that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has the chance to put its pants on. So my question would be, on your standpoint, is there a better way to go about fact checking than we are doing currently?
Well, I mean, I think there are certain ways that we can minimize being fed disinformation. And none of these will come as a surprise to anybody. But I think that we have to accept that some news outlets are reputable and have a reputation for checking the facts and making sure that they've got it right before they publish it. In British media parlance, that the story stacks up before they punted it out into the into the atmosphere, and also that we have to be aware that in this modern age, with social media and instant communications, everybody's a journalist these days, and you have to be very careful which journalists, in inverted commas, you choose to believe and to follow. And I think that it's incumbent on all of us not just to use one source of information, but to check it. And personally, I mean, I think that the BBC, by and large, is still a reputable organisation which seeks to present information in the correct way. Although there are lots of accusations that it's left wing, etc., etc. But I will read the Times newspaper, which is pretty establishment in Britain. I'll watch the BBC. And then I'll, if I've got time, and I have got time now that I'm retired, I'll look at Channel 4 News, which is got a leftist or leftish stance, and then I'll read The Guardian, which is leftist. And then you apply what I always say to my friends, which makes them laugh, is you apply the common sense test. Does this make sense to me? I've read the sources, I see what they're saying, and then you have to make your judgment. And I think that's what everybody has to do, because the world is full of echo chambers where people listen to just what they want to hear. And even if it's uncomfortable sometimes, you have to accept the fact that maybe the information you're getting from one source is actually wrong, even although you've always relied on it. And there's another angle to it. And, changing your mind has never not been part of the intellectual process. And I've done it more times than I care to remember. But I think we have to be alive to what's going on. We have to use multi-source, broad spectrum sources of information. And then I think we have to apply our judgment in a mature and sort of reasoned way. And I think that's the way to combat it. How you do that on an institutional basis, as in terms of military intelligence or whatever, I don't know.
Yeah, it is obviously a concern. It is one that there are many debates and conversations on. But yeah, no, even when it comes to just absorbing media content, I know some people get incredibly angry at me. Even people with a large amount of experience, a lot of professionalism, when I will quote or actually read material that comes from either Russian mill bloggers or Russian propagandists or Russian media channels, because sometimes they actually have information. or sometimes they actually have some level of real information. And I think that there is the at least calculation that sometimes you have to read disparate sources. And again, you have to practice a level of information security, or at least an understanding security, where you go into every source with a level of fact checking, with a level of understanding how to fact check, with a level of understanding what the source's potential biases are, and being able to sort of take those all into account when you actually read a source and absorb the information from that source. And I think a lot of people don't do that, which again, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest enemies of finding the truth is cognitive dissonance. By which I mean, don't give me that information because it doesn't agree with what I think already. And you see that all the time, and that's dangerous because people are closing their minds, not opening their minds.
Well, yeah, no, and absolutely. I mean, some of the largest, Ukrainian information environment Twitter accounts, um, don't literally just post text, with kind of feel good stories. And that's really attractive for people to read. If it's a feel good story, I'm gonna like it. I'm gonna retweet it. This is something that's really good for me. This is something that makes me feel good. And I think that is a huge part of how that information environment's kind of gone downhill.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. And on the other side of the equation, there's the fact that one of the early Ukrainian attacks foundered in a minefield, with the resulting destruction or incapacitation of a couple of Leopard 2A6s and a handful of American Bradley IFVs. And that, again, was seen in isolation and rebroadcast as on multiple different channels, to the extent that people thought, well, this is happening all over the front, and it was one incident.
I also think it was a prerequisite for every single Russian drone to, when they were going out on a mission in the area, to get another shot of the pileup for at least a week straight.
Yeah, can we have the wide angle shot this time, please?
Now a close up, and now a
Yeah,
long
yeah.
angle one from far away. And yeah, I think that is another part of at least the Russian information environment, has been the prolific reposting of any one victory. When the Russians have a victory, it's going to be filmed a lot. And that is one thing that, again, people who are on the pro Russia side of things, they'll see that it'll make them feel good, and they'll retweet the 15th or 16th different photo of the single event. And it's the feel goodism of the news.
You're absolutely right, and it happens in all walks of life, particularly in politics, when it comes to polling of potential votes at the next election in Scotland or in the UK, for example. People tend to post what they want to hear.
No, and I will never get involved in UK politics because I
Well, why not? It's just so much fun.
I'll leave that to you, George. You're a bit better at it than I am.
Come on, technical. You're telling me you didn't enjoy the cabbage?
Okay, the cabbage was legitimately hilarious, but that was because on its own, legitimately
And so was the
hilarious.
vegetable that they used to measure her time in office.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. Wasn't it a lettuce? Wasn't it a lettuce?
It was a lettuce, you're right.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm sure if the
And
Prince
now
of
you're
Wales,
spreading disinformation online.
no, but George, if the Prince of Wales breaks down again, next time it goes out, you're gonna have to put a lettuce out to see which goes first.
Very good.
Okay, and I think I has everyone gotten the major? I think I've hit the major notes that I have
Yeah.
for the week. Anyone else want to say anything?
Well, I can tell you what my next the piece that I'm writing at the moment is.
Oh, okay.
if that-
I'll take that anytime.
Yeah, if that's of any interest. I like you, I suspect, get a lot of my information from Twitter, and I stumbled across this Very short tweet from the BBC's defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale, who's actually in Ukraine and has been for some time. And he posed the question, what has happened or where are the 14 Challenger 2s that the UK supplied to Ukraine some months ago? And he apparently had asked two of the generals directing Ukrainian operations in the south and southeast of the country, who replied that they haven't got them. So it's slightly tabloid, but the question is, where are the UK tanks? Now, there could be a multitude of answers to that, of course. And we have to bear in mind that there's only 14 of them, so it's not a brigade's worth, it's a squad and company group's worth at best. And also that they may not be committed yet just because the brigade hasn't been committed yet. But it's an interesting little angle. So I'm writing something like that for the Daily Express, probably for Monday, basically saying where have the Challengers gone, and then leading on to the fact that the UK doesn't have a big enough tank fleet, which I think everybody knows. So
I think I can both answer your question here and give you another absolutely amazing angle to your article. But they most likely, we have one video so far. If just take any guess to what unit the Challenger 2s would have gone to.
Oh Lordy, I mean, I don't even know, but I would assume that it is a Western / NATO equipped brigade, which is probably still in reserve. Was that a good guess?
Somewhat, yes. They've actually gone to the Ukrainian air assault forces.
Really?
Who appear who appear now to be operating a mix of German supplied Marder 183s and Challenger 2s, which I do find incredibly funny, and I'll send you over. I did a bit of a dive into at least what we've seen so far. But they're most likely in Zoetermeer right now, at the 199th Training and Education Center.
Fantastic. Can you ping me that information?
I absolutely will.
Article.
Yes, and it's incredibly funny, and I think I said this, that it's air assault with 33.5-ton IFVs and 65-ton MBTs.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But they do appear to be, as you were saying, and I think you hit the nail on the head here, a unit or units that are more welcoming to Western standard equipment. Ukrainian air assault forces are typically seen as more, or not competent per se, but higher level of training, higher level of readiness.
Yep. Yes, absolutely. It's quite interesting that they've got a mix of German and British equipment. So, I mean, I know that everybody is waiting for the first videos of Challenger 2s in action, or Challenger 2s blowing their tracks off or being hit by Russian anti-tank missiles. And I've also postulated that Putin would be more than happy to capture one intact and parade it in Red Square. That hasn't happened yet, but who knows?
They have captured two. They captured a French AMX-10RC, which very understandable. Of course, the first vehicle they're going to capture is going to be effectively a scout car. And I believe they captured a Swedish, or potentially, I don't think they've actually managed to move it or recover it yet, a CVC-90.
Okay.
Both of which are very understandable that those would be the first vehicles captured.
Yeah. Well, I'd be really grateful if any of that information you can just ping across, because from open sources, I haven't had sight of that yet.
Yeah, we've got 2.5 minutes of Challenger 2's training at that training ground.
I have one final question for you, Stuart, and it's on behalf of our listeners. Now, I believe you have your own podcast. I've appeared on it before. So where might people find you if they want to hear more from you?
Well, George, you did appear on my own podcast, and in fact, you were our most distinguished guest to date on that, and we had great fun doing it. I've got a sort of small support mechanism behind me, and I'm just looking to make sure I get the website right. If people want to follow what I'm doing and see other podcasts and some of the writing I've been doing, and indeed some of the YouTube videos of speaking on TV and all that sort of stuff, it's on www.defense review.uk.
And that will be linked below as well.
Yeah, and that's run by a very nice chap called Tony Fitzpatrick, who is, well, George has met him, who's very much media savvy, and that's where most of my relevant stuff goes. So that's where it is. But otherwise, Daily Express, whatever it is, co.uk, carries maybe 2 or 3 columns a week at the moment.
That is a very solid number coming from our end.
Well, yeah, I mean it's fun. I do it actually because I've always written when I was serving and post-serving and on all sorts of things, mainly military, but quite a lot of social comment and occasionally some humorous stuff. And about stuff that I've noticed in the local community, etc., etc. So it's always been a hobby of mine. Plus book reviews, which I've done a few of as well. I think everybody does book reviews at some point in their writing career. But yeah, so that's where it is anyway, and you can catch it up there.
Yeah, I always find defense publications to be possibly, or at least primarily military staffed. Defense publications to be possibly some of the most helpful journals when it comes to actually understanding what's happening. Of course, me coming from the U.S. Navy side of things, we have the United States Naval Institute Proceedings, which is possibly one of the greatest in the field. And it's always great to see more actually come up with people who know what they're talking about.
Well, it is terrific, actually, and I do sort of delve into as many of these publications as I can, offline and online. But there's only so much you can read in a day.
Figure out how to get more of those hours in.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks,
My very great pleasure,
Thank you very much,
I've
Stuart.
enjoyed it thoroughly, and I hope we'll speak again at some point soon.
All right.